He asked it as a joke. A billionaire, tired of his own success, smirking as he flicked his glass and said, "So if you were me, where would you put a spare million?" But the answer he got didn't just surprise him. It cracked something open. Because sometimes the truth doesn't come from analysts in glass towers. It comes from a waitress with tired eyes, a quiet past, and a wound he helped create without ever knowing her name. In 5 seconds, her words reached a place money could never touch. They stripped away his certainty, exposed the man behind the spreadsheets, and forced him to face a question wealth cannot protect you from. What if the life you built was built on someone else's loss? This is the story of a joke that didn't land. And the moment a billionaire realized he was the punchline. Stay with me. Everything begins the night he met her. The knife-edge shimmer of the Denver skyline still clung to Ethan Cole's mind as he stepped into the warm glow of Timberline Steakhouse. It was the kind of place where the tables were heavy oak, the wine lists arrived in leather binders, va kak ku, citro chu, en troi, nh, m, t dong nh, cn, nv, a sang tr, ngv, a vo ngx, a. He had been here 1,000 times. Yet, tonight it felt no different than sitting in another conference room, another carefully polished box full of people pretending to be impressed with themselves. He loosened his tie. A long day had carved faint shadows under his eyes, the kind $1 billion couldn't soften. He was 46, widowed for 2 years, and measured his exhaustion in percentages: 40% work, 30% grief, 30% whatever else he didn't want to name. His phone buzzed every 10 seconds with messages from partners who thought the world would collapse without immediate answers. He didn't lift his eyes from the screen when the waitress arrived. "Evening, Mr. Cole," she said, placing a glass of sparkling water on the table. Her voice was steady, too steady for someone serving in a room where men like him treated waitstaff as part of the wallpaper. Ethan finally glanced up. Grace Miller. He'd seen her before, a woman somewhere between 35 and 40, white, slender, with quiet lines of fatigue around her eyes. Not the kind caused by late-night parties, but the kind earned from carrying life on your shoulders. Her brown hair was tied back neatly, and something about her posture suggested she'd learned to shrink herself in crowded places. Still, her eyes blue, clear, watchful, missed nothing. She didn't rush, she didn't tremble, she didn't flirt to earn tips. She simply existed, fully. Like she'd lived several lives before this one. "Yes," Ethan murmured, already half bored. "The usual." She wrote it down without looking impressed or intimidated, which irritated him more than he expected. He wasn't used to being met with indifference. Respect, fear, awe, those were normal. But indifference? To fill the silence, to fill the fatigue, to amuse himself. He lifted his glass, swirled the water, and let a careless smile creep across his lips. "So, Grace," he said, his tone light and razor-thin. "If you were me, where would you park a spare million this week?" He expected the typical reaction, awkward laughter, maybe a blush, maybe a polite, "Oh, I wouldn't know, sir," followed by her hurrying away. But she didn't do any of that. She paused. Not a long pause, just enough to make him look up fully for the first time all day. Her pen hovered above her pad. Her eyes met his, and for a moment it felt like she was studying not his face, but the person behind it. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but firmer than before. "Well," she said, "that depends on whether you want to sleep at night." Ethan blinked. It wasn't the answer he expected. Grace continued, gently, like someone describing weather rather than money. "If it were me, I wouldn't put a cent into anything, climbing too fast. That's usually a sign it's built on air. Folks forget we said the same thing before the crash in '08. They kept buying houses they couldn't afford, and investors kept selling dreams they knew would pop." Her eyes dipped to the water in his glass. "And when bubbles burst, people like me lose homes. People like you just lose patience." A beat of silence fell between them. Ethan stared. He'd heard market warnings from analysts who charged 5 figures an hour. He'd heard fear-mongering from pundits and arrogant noise from hedge fund managers. But he'd never heard someone talk about the market like that with such grounded clarity, without jargon, without ego. Just truth. Truth wrapped in lived experience. Most folks, she added softly, can't survive losing everything they've worked their whole lives for. But the people who push the numbers around, they never see the wreckage. They just see charts. Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He felt a slow burn rise in his chest, not anger, but something more unfamiliar. Something close to discomfort, shame, recognition. Grace didn't smirk. Didn't act like she'd said something profound. She simply closed her notebook. "Your steak will be out shortly," she said, and turned to walk away. But Ethan couldn't look away. He watched her move between tables with quiet efficiency, her shoulders straight despite the long shifts she must have worked. She didn't seem to realize she had just knocked the air out of a billionaire who spent decades believing he understood people. And there he sat, a man who owned half the skyline outside, unable to think of a single clever thing to say next. Ethan picked up his phone again, trying to regain the illusion of control, but the screen blurred. Grace's words echoed like a voice he'd almost forgotten, someone calling him out, not for profit margins, but for being human. He rubbed his jaw, unsettled. A waitress had just seen straight through him. A waitress had just spoken a truth no one in his world dared to say aloud. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, that she said it, or that she was right. He set his phone down slowly, thoughtfully, his appetite fading, a pressure building behind his ribs he couldn't quite name. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole felt small. And somewhere across the room, Grace moved on to another table, unaware that she had just cracked open the first fault line in a life he'd built on steel and certainty. It was just one sentence, one moment, one unexpected mirror held up by a stranger. But it was enough to start the unraveling. And Ethan, stunned into silence, wasn't ready for what that unraveling would reveal. The night air in Denver was cool enough to sting the tips of Grace Miller's fingers as she stepped out the back door of Timberline Steakhouse. She pulled her thrift store coat tighter around her, the fabric thinning at the elbows after too many winters. The alley smelled faintly of garlic and exhaust, but to her it was simply the familiar scent of closing time. Another shift done, another day survived. Her 10-year-old sedan waited 3 blocks down, its fading blue paint chalky under the streetlights. She unlocked it, tossed her apron onto the passenger seat, and sat for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel. The quiet settled around her like a second skin. She hadn't meant to say those things to Ethan Cole. Not like that, not so directly. But sometimes the truth slipped out when she was too tired to hold it in. The car groaned as she turned the key. She let the heater struggle awake before pulling into the patchwork of city streets that led home. Her apartment was in an aging walk-up with cracked concrete steps and a single flickering hallway light. Inside, the carpet was worn, and the walls thin enough that she could hear the neighbor's old radio humming late-night jazz. But it was hers, or at least as much as anything could be, when rent ate half her paycheck. She flicked on the lamp by the kitchen table. And that was when her second life came into view. Stacks of library books towered in uneven piles, finance textbooks, market history, articles on debt cycles, business ethics, community development. Notes were taped to the wall. Hand-sketched diagrams, names of economists, scribbled questions she chased on her evenings off. Grace moved slowly around the room, slipping off her shoes, stretching her aching feet, before lowering herself into the worn chair. She opened a notebook, its pages cluttered with her handwriting. Simple, careful, practiced. A chart of housing prices. A list titled, "What We Should Have Known Back Then." A quote from her father. Her chest tightened. 8 miles north, in a quiet nursing home that smelled of antiseptic and fading memories, her father was likely sitting in his recliner watching the same old Western reruns. Some nights he remembered her name. Some nights he didn't. The early onset Alzheimer's had crept in 2 years ago like a thief, robbing him piece by piece. She visited almost every day before her shifts. 12 miles round trip, half a tank every 3 days. A bill she absorbed with the same silent resilience she used for everything else. She pulled out her phone and checked the nursing home's app. Your father took his evening medication, resting. Relief came in a slow breath. She set the phone aside, letting the weight of the day sink into her bones. Then memory rose soft-edged, tinted in the warm gold of another life. The hardware store. Her family's store. Miller's Hardware, Main Street, Cedar Ridge, Colorado. She could still smell sawdust when she thought of it, still hear the cheerful ding of the old brass bell above the door. Her father would whistle while restocking shelves. Her mother would run the register, greeting everyone by name. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was a good one, until the day a real estate developer arrived, wearing an expensive coat and a smile too polished to trust. He carried a portfolio that spoke of revitalization and unlocking underutilized value. The town council believed him. Many small business owners didn't, but belief didn't matter. The leveraged buyout of the surrounding properties tipped the balance. The strip was lost. Miller's Hardware is no longer aligned with our long-term investment goals, the young rep had said with crisp professionalism the week they were forced to close. Her parents lost everything: their store, their savings, their dignity. Grace lost her home. She blinked the memories away, blinking back the sting behind her eyes. She reached for another book, a thick volume on market ethics, when her gaze stopped on a single item on the table. An old envelope, faded, yellowing, the corner slightly torn. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she sat still and let memories tug at her with slow, aching fingers. 3 years ago, after her parents lost the store, she had written letters, angry letters, pleading letters, desperate letters to reporters, to regulators, to the investment firm behind the buyout. Most never responded. One responded with cold bureaucracy. Slowly, Grace pulled the envelope toward her. She slid a thumb beneath the flap and opened it. Inside, a single sheet of crisp paper, heavy stock, embossed letterhead, an emblem she had memorized long ago. A sleek silver crest representing a merged financial empire. Coal Capital. Her breath caught. Not because she hadn't seen it before, she'd read this letter 100 times over the years, but because tonight, suddenly, jarringly, that name felt different. She reread the letter, the words still edged with the same flawless corporate distance. We regret to inform you that Coal Capital is not liable for the financial losses incurred by Miller's Hardware. We appreciate your understanding. Understanding, as if understanding could rebuild a home, as if understanding could undo the unraveling of a life. Grace folded the letter carefully and slid it back inside the envelope. She closed her eyes, exhaled. Then, with slow deliberation, she stood and tucked the envelope into the drawer next to her old calculator and the photos of the store that no longer existed. Finally, she sat again, letting the small apartment wrap around her. Ethan Cole had no idea. Not tonight. Not when he tossed out that careless question at Silverwood. Not when she answered him with the weight of a life he couldn't imagine. He didn't know that his world had touched hers before, long before. His firm, his empire, had played a role in destroying her family's legacy. And as Grace leaned her elbows on the table, staring down at the notes she'd written across years of late nights, something inside her stirred, a mixture of sadness, frustration, and a quiet resolve that had carried her this far. Tomorrow she would see him again, not by choice, just by circumstance. But tonight, for the first time, a question rose in her chest. If Ethan Cole ever learned who she really was, what would he do? She closed her notebook slowly, the room sinking into silence. And in that silence lay the beginning of something neither of them could yet see. The city looked different from 40 floors up, cleaner somehow, almost peaceful. Ethan Cole stood before the glass wall of his office. Denver stretched beneath him like a map he'd learned to read in reverse. Streetlights blinked along the avenues. Tiny headlights crawled through the arteries of the city. And yet, for the first time in months, none of it held his attention. All he could hear was Grace's voice. Not the words. Exactly, he'd already memorized those, but the tone. Firm, steady, unafraid. People forget what 2008 did to regular families. Mr. Cole. You don't solve fear by playing with numbers on a screen. He exhaled, annoyed at himself for remembering the sentence perfectly. He shouldn't. He had no reason to. She was a waitress. He met hundreds of people a year, investors, entrepreneurs, analysts with framed credentials and Ivy League polish. None of them managed to burrow into his mind like she had. He turned away from the window and loosened his tie. A soft knock broke the silence. "Evening reports," his assistant, Lila, announced, setting a neat stack of folders on his desk. "You said you wanted the latest risk analyses summarized." "Thanks, leave them." When she left, Ethan dropped into his leather chair and flipped one folder open. There it was: charts, graphs. A full-page breakdown on emerging market bubbles, risk factors, overheated valuation models, even a footnote referencing the housing crisis. It was Grace's answer. Dressed up, sanitized, wrapped in 12-page jargon, he leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He should have been satisfied, validated even. But instead, irritation pricked at him. His own analysts wrote this: the best in the region. Experts. Specialists. And yet, she'd said it first. And better. Cleaner. What the hell was a woman like that doing serving ribeyes? He glanced back at the report, then closed it with a sigh that felt heavier than expected. Impulse tugged at him. He picked up his phone. "Call the restaurant," he muttered to himself. He didn't call, he texted. Less conspicuous that way. "Ethan. Grace, the waitress who served me Tuesday. How long has she been with you?" The manager's reply came quickly. "Manager. About 8 months. Hardworking." Another message. "Manager. Reads on breaks. Big books. Finance stuff, I think." Finance stuff. He frowned. Most people took breaks by scrolling through social media or watching videos. He certainly didn't expect a waitress to spend her 15 minutes buried in market theory. Another text buzzed. "Manager. No drama with her. Good worker. Quiet, private. Not seeking attention." Another reason she lingered in his thoughts because she hadn't tried to impress him or flatter him. She hadn't even seemed fazed by who he was. He pushed away from the desk and crossed to a side table where his laptop waited. One quick search became 2. Then 10. Public records, credit checks, addresses, employment history. The basics painted a picture of someone who existed, but only just. Sparse digital footprint. No college degree, no professional licenses, no social media presence outside an old Facebook page, abandoned years ago. A few bills. A rental agreement. It didn't add up. Someone with that clarity, someone who looked at markets with lived understanding instead of academic detachment, should have been somewhere else. A bank, an advisory firm, a nonprofit, anywhere but wiping down tables at Timberline Steakhouse. Ethan closed the laptop slowly. He wasn't a man who chased curiosities. He built companies, closed deals, forecasted futures. But that night, with the city glittering below him and silence filling the corners of his life, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A pull. 2 nights later, he acted on it. He showed up at Silverwood unannounced, stepping through the entrance as if he had somewhere else more important to be. He didn't ask for a corner booth or a private table, he simply told the host, "Wherever Grace's section is." Her eyes widened for a moment when she saw him. A quick flicker surprise, then guarded neutrality. "Mr. Cole," she said politely, setting down a glass of water. "Back so soon?" He offered a half-smile. "I figured I owed my last conversation a second chance." "I wasn't exactly present the first time." Grace didn't soften. She didn't lean in or play up the moment. She simply waited. "So," Ethan said, leaning back in the chair, "if I asked you again, where would you put a spare million this week?" Her eyebrows lifted, not amused. "Is this another joke, or are you planning to take it seriously this time?" "Touché." He set his phone face down on the table. A gesture most people begged him for, but rarely received. "Serious," he said honestly. Her expression shifted, not friendliness, not flattery, but something closer to concern. "You know," she began carefully, "most people asking questions like that aren't really looking for advice. They're looking for entertainment, for something clever to repeat later. I'm not most people. That's exactly what most people say. He exhaled a short, surprised laugh. She had a talent for cutting through ego, something few dared attempt with him. I'd like to hear your thoughts, he said, tone lowering. For real, at my office. One afternoon. I'll compensate you for the time. Grace stiffened. Mr. Cole, she said evenly. I give free refills. Not financial performances. It wasn't anger. It was self-protection, and he recognized it instantly. Ethan didn't push. He simply nodded once, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the table, no flourish, no dramatic pause, just presence. If you ever want to get paid to say the truths you already know, he said quietly, call. He stood, thanked her for the service genuinely, and left without another word. Grace watched him go, her face unreadable. When she finally cleared the table, she spotted the card. She hesitated, then slipped it into her apron pocket with a shake of her head. She'd ignore it. Of course she would. People like Ethan Cole lived in a world she had no intention of stepping into ever again. But later, in the quiet of her car, the card pressed faintly against her leg, like a heartbeat she didn't want to acknowledge. Unwelcome, insistent, and impossible to forget. The nursing home always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and warm oatmeal. Grace Miller pushed through the double doors, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear as she signed in. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, catching dust in the air and turning it gold. She hated that it looked beautiful here. Beauty made guilt harder. Her father sat in his usual armchair near the small TV. A John Wayne movie played softly, horses kicking up desert dust across the screen. He was leaning forward, lips parted slightly, eyes locked on the action with the boyish fascination he'd had since she was young. Hey, Dad, she said gently. He looked up, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, he said her name without hesitation. Gracie? A smile broke across his weathered face. You're home from college, early. The words hit her like a soft punch to the ribs. She swallowed. Yeah, Dad. I had some extra time. He patted the armrest beside him. Come tell me what you're studying now. Economics, isn't it? You always had the sharpest mind. She sat, forcing a smile even as her throat tightened. I'm learning a lot. He nodded, satisfied, turning his gaze back to the screen. You keep at it. Your mother always said you were going to change the world. Grace couldn't speak. If she did, the truth would spill out that she wasn't in college, hadn't been in years, that life had swept her dreams into corners too dark to search. Instead, she watched his profile, the familiar slope of his nose, the thinning hair, the spots on his hands. She clung to the moment. Good days were rare. Good moments even rarer. 40 minutes later, an administrator tapped lightly on the doorframe. Miss Miller, may I speak with you? Her stomach dropped. She followed the woman down the hall to a small office lit by harsh fluorescent lights. A folder sat waiting on the desk, the kind that never held good news. The administrator cleared her throat softly. I'll be direct. The new medication your father needs, the one his doctor prescribed for his cognitive decline, has been denied for full coverage. Grace blinked. Denied? He's been responding to it. I know, the woman said, compassion flickering across her face. But insurance protocols changed this quarter. They'll only cover the generic alternative. That alternative makes him confused and aggressive, Grace whispered. You've seen it. I have, the administrator admitted. But our hands are tied. The out-of-pocket cost is steep. How steep? The woman hesitated, then slid a paper across the desk. Grace stared. $3,147.93. Month. Effective immediately, the administrator added softly. And, Miss Miller, you're already behind on last month's balance. For a moment, the room hummed. The fluorescent lights pulsed. Her ears buzzed. She managed a single nod, thanked the woman in a voice that didn't feel like hers, and walked out. The drive back to the city blurred past in fragments, tail lights, stoplights, glimpses of mountains in the distance. She didn't cry. She'd passed the stage where crying helped. Hours later, after closing time at the steakhouse, she sat alone in the staff diner, a dim room with metal chairs, a humming soda machine, and the lingering smell of grease. Her feet throbbed inside her shoes. Someone had left a half-eaten slice of pie on the counter. The radio played an old song she recognized but couldn't name. She laid her bag on the table and let it spill open. Keys. Chapstick. A pen. A crumpled receipt. And Ethan's business card. Thick, heavy, embossed. The kind of card meant to be taken seriously. Grace picked it up slowly. Her pride rose first, hot, stubborn, protective. Accepting anything from a billionaire felt like betrayal. Betrayal of her father, of her mother's memory, of Miller's hardware, and everything that had crumbled because of people who treated livelihoods like chess pieces. But then the numbers returned. $3,000. Every month, on top of last month's overdue balance. Her father's voice echoing, "You're home from college early," tightened her chest. He didn't remember the truth. But she did. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the card over. His private office number. Clean, professional, no gimmicks. "Don't," she whispered to herself. She couldn't let him use her. Couldn't be a spectacle for his amusement or curiosity. But she also couldn't lose her father piece by piece because of a bill. Minutes passed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Her coffee cooled untouched. Finally, quietly, she unlocked her phone. Her thumb hovered over the numbers. "It's just a conversation," she told herself. "Not a promise, not surrender." She dialed. 1 ring. 2. She expected voicemail. Most people like Ethan let machines answer their calls after hours. But his voice came through, smooth and alert. "Cole." She froze, caught off guard by how quickly he'd answered. "Mr. Cole," she said, hearing her own voice waver. "It's Grace." From Silverwood, a beat of silence. Then something warm, almost pleased, entered his tone. "Grace, I wasn't expecting your call. I'm not agreeing to anything," she said quickly. "But I'm willing to come to your office, once." "I appreciate that," he replied. "Truly. But listen carefully," she added, her voice hardening with a resolve she didn't quite feel strong enough to hold. "If at any point this feels like a joke to you, again, if I feel like you're just bored or looking for entertainment, I walk. And you never come back to my section. Ever." There was a soft exhale on the other end. Not disbelief. Not offense. Something closer to respect. "Deal," Ethan said. "And for the record, Grace, I have no interest in wasting your time." She didn't answer. She simply ended the call, her heart thudding in her chest. The diner hummed around her, empty and still, as she tucked his card back into her bag with hands that were no longer steady. Grace closed her eyes. She had just stepped toward a world she'd promised herself she would never touch again. Grace Miller stood at the base of the shimmering glass tower of Cole Hart Capital, staring up at 40 floors of wealth and ambition stacked against the sky. Her breath fogged faintly in the morning cold. She smoothed the front of her best blouse clean but faded and prayed her worn black heels wouldn't betray her on the marble floors inside. She didn't belong here. Anyone could see that. But she walked in anyway. The lobby was wide, echoing, wrapped in steel and glass. A living sculpture of success. The receptionist, a woman with sculpted hair and a blazer worth more than Grace's entire month's rent, looked her up and down, her smile frozen in polite disbelief. "Can I help you?" The subtext. "Are you lost?" "I'm here to see Mr. Cole," Grace answered calmly. "And you are?" "Grace Miller." A pause. The receptionist blinked once, twice, as if searching her mental database. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes. 10 o'clock. The woman checked, and stiffened slightly when the system confirmed it. "Oh, yes, of course." A forced smile. "I'll have someone escort you." Grace didn't react. She'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't something you earned, it was something you decided to carry, whether people handed it to you or not. An assistant led her through a maze of glass offices and conference rooms filled with people in tailored suits hunched over glowing screens. Conversations paused as she passed, eyes following her with thinly veiled curiosity. A waitress walking into a boardroom. An oddity. A disruption. Good, she thought. They should feel disrupted. When they reached the executive conference room, Ethan Cole stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, every inch the polished billionaire. He turned as she stepped in, and for a moment his expression softened. Not pity, not surprise, recognition. "Grace," he said warmly. "You made it." She nodded once. "You said 10. I'm here at 10. He hid a small smile, then motioned for her to come closer. Around the table, 4 members of his inner circle waited: senior analysts, legal counsel, strategy directors. Their suits were sharp, their eyes sharper. They had the kind of posture that said they were used to being the smartest people in any room. "This is Grace Miller," Ethan announced. "She's consulting with us today." Consulting. The word hit the air like a stone dropped into still water. The polite facade held, but Grace could feel the skepticism tighten, the room-tight smiles, slightly raised eyebrows, a subtle checking of one another before turning attention back to Ethan. "What we're reviewing today," he continued, "is the Cross Pines Senior Living acquisition. I'd like her to listen. At the end, I want her honest impressions. Honest. That, at least, she could do." The lead analyst dimmed the lights and launched into the presentation. Slides glowed, with projections, graphs, maps, revenue curves, and carefully polished language. Crosspine owned senior living facilities across 5 states. The acquisition promised predictable cash flow, operational efficiencies, vertical integration, all the phrases that made investors lean forward and nod. Grace kept her eyes on the slides, her expression unreadable. 15 minutes in, Ethan glanced at her. She hadn't taken any notes. She hadn't asked any questions. She simply watched, absorbing every detail. When the presentation ended, the team shifted expectantly, waiting for Ethan to invite praise, critiques, the usual ritual of corporate analysis. Instead, he turned to her. "Grace, what do you feel?" A few smirks flashed around the room, quickly hidden. She ignored them. Her gaze swept back to the screen. "May I see slide 12 again?" The analyst clicked back. Grace stepped forward, closer to the table, her finger hovering near a line of text in light gray font. "Why is the food budget dropping by 15% next quarter?" The analyst blinked. "Market realignment, supply chain strategy." "No," Grace cut in, her voice steady. "That's too large a drop, especially when your projected resident count increases." A subtle ripple of discomfort moved through the room. She glanced at another slide. "And this staff hours reduced by 6% across all facilities. But executive bonuses rise by 8%. A silence settled. Legal counsel cleared his throat. "That's a proposed restructuring model. Nothing finalized." Grace nodded, unfazed, then pointed at a single line buried in the lower half of a financial table. "Liability reserves increased by 40%. The legal counsel stiffened. "It's standard to adjust reserves with any major consolidation." She turned her head slowly toward him. "Not like this. Not unless you know you're going to get sued." Every breath in the room went still. People don't budget for lawsuits unless they've already decided who gets hurt to save money, she said softly. "You're buying a company that knows its cuts are going to cause harm. The question isn't if something bad happens, it's when." The air thickened, heavy and electric. The analysts looked at each other. Ethan didn't look at anyone except her. She let her hand drop, stepping back. "That's all." For a moment, just one, nobody spoke. Then Ethan straightened. "Thank you, Grace." He turned to his team, voice crisp. Arguments rose behind their eyes, but none dared voice them. One by one, they filed out. When the glass door shut behind the last of them, silence filled the space like a held breath. Ethan stood very still at the head of the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "They missed it," he said. "My best team missed it." Grace's gaze remained steady. He sat down slowly, the weight of the realization settling on him. "Grace, how did you see it so fast?" She didn't answer immediately. She just lifted her eyes to meet his. And for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Respect. Sharp. Undeniable. And growing. What he didn't yet know, what she wasn't ready to reveal, was that senior living facilities weren't just numbers to her. They were where her father slept tonight, and where she feared he might suffer if men like Ethan didn't look more carefully. "How did you see it so fast?" Ethan finally asked. They were alone now. The glass-walled conference room had gone still, the skyline of Denver glowing like a distant constellation behind them. His team had retreated to their offices, muttering under their breath, shaken by how a waitress had outpaced them. But Ethan wasn't shaken. He was unsettled, because he genuinely didn't know the answer to his own question. Grace didn't move immediately. She rested a hand lightly on the back of a chair, her shoulders tired but steady. "That line about liability reserves?" she said quietly. "I've seen something like it before." "Where?" His voice was softer than he meant it to be. "At my father's nursing home." That made him straighten. Grace kept her eyes on the city. "Every time a new company buys the place, I read all the little notices they post on the bulletin board. Food menus change, staffing schedules shift, new rules about what they'll cover, what's no longer included in standard care. And there's always a line about liability adjustments. Always." She took a breath, steady and practiced someone used to swallowing her frustration before it showed. "When those numbers change," she said, "my dad feels it. Residents feel it. They don't know how to read spreadsheets. But they know when dinner gets smaller, when the nurse who helps them dress disappears because her hours were cut, when the building gets quieter at night because they reduced overnight staff." Her voice didn't tremble. That somehow made it hit harder. Ethan leaned a hand on the table. He'd built a whole career on optimization, streamlining, efficiency, tightening operations until margins glowed. He'd believed back then that wise optimization made life better for everyone. But standing in front of Grace now, he couldn't ignore the truth tightening around his chest. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped thinking about the faces behind the numbers. "Your father," he said slowly. "How long has he been in care?" 2 years, she replied. "Early Alzheimer's." That explained the flicker of sadness he'd sensed in her, the weight she carried like an invisible backpack she'd never set down. "I'm sorry," he murmured. The words came out instinctively. She nodded once, not brushing it away, not dwelling in it, just accepting the reality she lived with. "Grace," he said, choosing his words carefully, "you looked at those documents and saw something I've forgotten how to see." She finally turned toward him. Her expression wasn't accusatory, just honest. "People like my dad feel every line in those spreadsheets," she said softly. "They just don't know how to read them." Something inside him cracked quietly, but unmistakably. For years, he'd been applauded for turning metrics into success stories. Investors praised him, magazines quoted him, politicians invited him to dinners. He'd become a symbol of the modern, efficient American businessman. But a waitress had just reminded him of something he used to know. Numbers were only as moral as the people interpreting them. He cleared his throat. "Grace, would you be willing to review a few more deals? Nothing heavy. I'll compensate you. Fairly." Fairly. She blinked, surprised, suspicious, then thoughtful. "After my shifts," she said, "I still need my job. Of course. And I won't dress up," she added, "or pretend to be someone else." "You don't need to," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something invisible, then nodded. Over the next several weeks, she came in twice a week after closing the restaurant, leaving faint scents of coffee, fryer grease, and winter air behind her. She always arrived with the same worn heels and the same tired but determined gaze. Ethan began to notice the things she never mentioned. The way she took the stairs instead of the elevator, the way she brought her own thermos of tea rather than accept anything from the executive pantry, the way she flinched slightly whenever a security guard greeted her like she was bracing for someone to tell her she didn't belong. But she belonged. More than half the suits sitting around him most days. Her presence changed the room, changed him. Some nights she sat across the table from him, reviewing a stack of papers in silence while the city spread out beneath them. "You know," he said once, "most consultants would kill for this view." She didn't even glance at the skyline. "I'm not most consultants." He realized he liked that more than he should have. Each time she finished a set of documents, she left concise notes in the margins. Not technical, not academic. Human. She wrote things like, "What does this do to the people earning minimum wage? This looks profitable, but it assumes families won't fight back. You should ask yourself why they're hiding staff turnover data." Her clarity was unnerving. Her courage, more so. One night, long after most of the building had emptied, Ethan found a file she'd reviewed earlier lying on his desk. Her handwriting sat at the bottom, in her simple, neat script. He read the line once. Then again, "The return on this investment is high. The cost to your soul might be higher." He sank into his chair. The city lights shimmered outside, a silent web of ambition and opportunity. He'd always loved this view. Loved what it represented. But tonight it felt different. Like a reflection of everything he had become and everything he had lost along the way. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the words she'd written. Long enough for the building to hum itself into stillness. Long enough for a cold draft to brush the back of his neck. He should have filed the document. Or dismissed it. He didn't. Instead, he folded the note slowly, carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. Grace didn't know it, but she'd just shifted the axis of his world. And as the night deepened around him, one thought kept circling his mind. If a waitress could see this so clearly, what else had he been blind to? It had begun so subtly that Ethan barely noticed the shift. A question here. A late-night message asking her opinion. A habit of sliding documents across the table toward her before he looked at them himself. Within weeks, her insights became the first filter he trusted. Not his analysts. Not his board. Not even the partners who had built Coalheart Capital with him. Grace, a waitress with tired eyes and a quiet voice, had become the compass he didn't know he'd lost. And he kept it quiet. He told himself it was to avoid scrutiny. Avoid explaining what he couldn't fully explain yet. But deep down, he knew the truth. Part of him didn't want anyone else to have access to the clarity she offered. His board, however, had no interest in clarity. They wanted profit. "Crosspine is a clean acquisition," one partner insisted. "We've run the numbers 3 times. Numbers aren't the issue," another chimed. "We're leaving money on the table by delaying." "Ethan, it's practically done. Sign it." In every meeting, pressure tightened like a vice around his ribs. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's handwriting. People don't budget for lawsuits unless they already know they're cutting corners. His partners didn't know that the real reason he hesitated had nothing to do with margins. It had everything to do with humanity. And with her. One rainy evening, after a grueling day of arguments and projections and increasingly frustrated board members, Ethan found Grace sitting at the long conference table, reviewing another file. The storm outside turned the windows into dark mirrors, blurring the city lights. Her hair was damp around the edges. She must have come straight from work. "You're here early," he said, dropping his coat on a chair. "Shift ended at 6. She didn't look up. Had time to stop by. There was something off in her voice tonight. A distance. He stepped closer. "You okay?" She flipped a page. "I'm fine." He studied her for a moment. She wasn't fine. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight. "Grace," he said gently, taking a seat beside her. "You can tell me." She shook her head and closed the folder. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." That made her pause. Slowly, she reached into her bag. For a moment, he thought she was searching for her notes or a pen. But when she withdrew her hand, she held an envelope. Old, worn, edges softened by time and handling. She hesitated long enough for him to sense that whatever was inside carried weight. Finally, she slid it across the table toward him. "This," she whispered, "is why I knew that acquisition was rotten, why numbers like that make my stomach twist." Ethan frowned and opened the flap. A foreclosure notice. Filed 8 years ago. A property in Cedar Ridge, Colorado. His eyes moved to the top corner. The logo stared back at him. Silver. Embossed. Familiar. Coalheart Capital. His breath left his body. The room felt smaller somehow. Grace watched him, her face unreadable. "My parents owned a hardware store," she began quietly. "Small place. Honest work. They'd been there 25 years. Rain tapped relentlessly against the glass as she spoke. The new redevelopment project came in. Promised more tourism, more money for the town. They bought out half the block and raised leases on the rest. My parents couldn't keep up. Her words were steady, but the pain beneath them trembled like a fault line. They fought it, she continued. They tried everything, but numbers on a balance sheet weighed more than people. She folded her hands in her lap. My dad had a heart attack the year they lost the store. Not fatal, but it shaved years off him. My mom, she tried to hide it, but the depression ate at her. She passed 3 years later. A beat. Then another. Ethan stared at the notice. The logo he'd seen his whole career on press releases, contracts, investor decks. He had never wondered where else it appeared. "How long ago was this?" he asked quietly. 8 years. His voice dropped. Grace. I didn't personally handle every acquisition. The firm. I know, she said softly. I know, it wasn't you sitting at a desk making decisions about my family, but it was your world. Your rules, your signature. She tapped the corner of the notice. You came into my life once already. Ethan sat back, stunned. The rain outside blurred the city, turning lights into streaks, and his throat tightened with something he couldn't name. Guilt, but deeper, older, inherited. He whispered almost without meaning to. I've seen that logo my whole life, and never wondered whose front door it was taped to. Grace's eyes met his. It was taped to ours. A quiet settled over the room, heavy, unflinching. Ethan looked down at the notice again, then at the woman beside him, this woman who had carried that weight, that loss, into a fluorescent-lit diner and then into his boardroom. He felt something inside him shift. Uncomfortable. Humbling. Human. Grace, he began, but the words faltered. There were 1,000 things he could say. None felt like enough. The storm rumbled distantly, and the room held its breath as the truth sat between them like an open wound. Grace stood slowly, slipping her bag over her shoulder. I didn't tell you this to punish you, she said. You asked why I saw those red flags. That's why. I don't see numbers first. I see people. Because I lived on the other side of your spreadsheets. She turned toward the door. He rose instinctively. Grace, wait. But she didn't. She walked out before he could find the words to stop her. He stood there long after she was gone, one hand resting on the back of her empty chair. Rain streaking the glass behind him, unable to shake the feeling that, for the first time in years, he was finally seeing the cost of the empire he'd built, and what it had taken from her. The boardroom hummed like a machine well-oiled by ambition. Charts flickered across the massive wall screen. Projections soared upward in crisp lines of blue and green. Words like scalability, market opportunity, and efficiency gains floated through the air with the polished confidence of people who believed they already knew the ending of the story. Ethan Cole sat at the head of the table, silent. The Crosspine Senior Living acquisition was back on the agenda. Bigger now. More pressure. More excitement. The analysts had doubled their certainty. The legal team had prepped the contracts. His partners were practically glowing. This deal, his CFO announced, tapping a slide with a silver pen, has the potential to raise our Q4 projections by 8%. A partner leaned in. Ethan, this is a no-brainer. We've rerun everything she questioned. Numbers check out. They meant Grace, but never said her name in the room. As if acknowledging a waitress had flagged what they missed would crack the walls. Another voice chimed in. And the street will reward us. Investors love consolidation plays. We're primed for a stock jump. Ethan's jaw tightened. He saw none of the excitement, none of the glory. He saw his father-in-law, Mr. Miller, frail, confused, staring at a dinner tray that had less on it than the day before because someone higher up the chain had moved funds around. He saw Grace's mother's handwriting on the foreclosure folder she kept, saw the empty storefront in Cedar Ridge, saw the price of efficiency. One of the partners asked, Ethan, thoughts? He cleared his throat. I have questions. A few tired sighs drifted around the table. He ignored them. What about the liability reserves? His CFO offered a smooth smile. Industry standard when switching management structures. We've been through this. Ethan shook his head. Not at this scale. Ethan, his legal chief added, voice dipped in professional calm. Every acquisition carries risk. That's why the reserves exist. Nothing personal, just business. Nothing personal, just business. The phrase grated against him like sand against metal. Because Grace's voice whispered beneath it, people like my dad feel every line in those spreadsheets. His peers moved on, flipping to the next slide. They talked about expected returns, market share, projected savings. He heard none of it. He felt the slow churn of something unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable warming in his chest. Conscience, raw and unfiltered, was a muscle he hadn't used in years. When the meeting adjourned, his partners walked out energized. Money had momentum. Money loved applause. But Ethan stayed seated. He stared at the signature page left in front of him. The clean white paper that represented millions in profit, accolades, glowing headlines, and the quiet suffering of people who would lose meals, nurses, and safety because of it. The pen lay waiting beside the dotted line. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he reached for his phone. His fingers hovered a moment hesitating, searching for courage he wasn't proud to need before he snapped a photo of the page. He sent it to the one person he trusted to tell him the truth. Ethan, text, "If I sign this, what does it make me?" He stared at the screen, waiting. The minutes dragged. The building quieted outside his office, desks emptying, lights dimming. Through the glass panels, he saw the reflection of a man he barely recognized, sharp suit, polished shoes, hair immaculate, and beneath it all, a fault line running through his chest. 20 minutes passed. No answer. He set the phone down, picked up the pen, closed his eyes. He imagined Grace's father sitting in his recliner, trying to remember her name. Imagined a nurse's shift shortened. Imagined a kitchen forced to stretch a food budget that already felt thin. The pen hovered. His partners were expecting a signature before morning. The street was expecting an announcement. The entire firm was ready to move. But his hand shook, really shook. He exhaled, slow, deep, like he had to make room for air around the guilt pressing into him. The pen touched the page, then stopped. He placed it down carefully. A long silence filled the office. For the first time in his career, Ethan Cole let a major deal stall, not because the numbers were wrong, not because the board objected, but because he could no longer force himself to be the man who signed things without considering the people crushed beneath the ink. He walked to the window. Rain tapped gently against the glass, the city smeared into streaks of gray and gold. His phone vibrated once. A message from Grace. He reached for it, pulse quickening. But before he could read her reply, he felt something shift in the space around him, a sense that whichever direction he moved next would change everything. He held the phone in his hand, the screen glowing faintly, and the answer waited there, still unread. As he stood suspended between the man he had been and the man he might finally become. Rumors in a place like Coal Heart Capital spread the way cracks do, in glass quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere. By the next morning, every corner of the firm hummed with whispers. Some said Ethan was having a breakdown. Some said he was losing his edge. But most repeated the same phrase, with a mix of amusement and contempt. He's going soft. Ethan heard it as he stepped out of the elevator, two junior analysts murmuring near the break room, pretending not to notice him. He kept walking, but the looks followed him, puzzled, judgmental, calculating. By noon, his assistant informed him that a board member had called an urgent discussion for that evening. A phrase that meant, "Fix your behavior or we fix it for you." He tried to focus on work, but every number blurred into another reminder of the deal he hadn't signed. Every email from his partners was tinged with impatience, irritation, veiled threats. Around 3, he stepped into the hallway outside his office and froze. Voices drifted from a partly open conference room. "Ethan's judgment is compromised," his CFO said, his tone clipped, cold. Another voice snorted, "A waitress playing consultant. That's what we've come to?" A low chuckle followed. There was more sarcasm, laughter, irritation thrown like darts, but Ethan didn't hear it. Not really. Because one truth hit him like a slap. A part of him had once thought the same thing. Before the late nights, before the quiet, unvarnished honesty, before he realized she was the only one in the building telling the truth without agenda. Shame curled in his stomach. He stepped back before they saw him, hands trembling unconsciously as he closed his office door behind him. He should have let himself breathe. He should have waited before calling her. But pressure had a way of shrinking a man's better instincts until he was left grasping at whatever felt like control. He messaged Grace, asking her to stop by. She arrived 20 minutes later, still in her work clothes, hair pinned back, the faint smell of the steakhouse kitchen clinging to her coat. She took one look at him, at the tension, stiffening his jaw. The exhaustion carved around his eyes, and immediately sensed something was wrong. "You wanted to talk?" she said quietly. He didn't start gently. "What did you expect would happen?" Ethan snapped, pacing behind his desk. "That I'd just halt a major acquisition because of your stories?" She blinked. Once, slowly. "My stories? You've filled my head with worst-case scenarios, personal tragedies, emotional." He gestured vaguely, harshly. "You're swaying my judgment, Grace. You're making me look unstable in front of my own board." Her expression tightened, a subtle wince, hidden behind control. "If you think I'm doing that, then maybe you never wanted my honesty in the first place." "That's not it," he shot back. "This deal means hundreds of jobs, futures for people who work here. You're pushing me to tank it based on feelings." Grace stared at him, really stared, like she was trying to find the man she'd seen glimpses of these past weeks. "I didn't ask you to tank anything," she said softly. "I told you the truth. You asked me for that. Every single time." He ran a hand through his hair, restless. "Your truth is costing me traction with my own partners. Do you understand that? Do you understand the position you're putting me in?" A flicker of pain crossed her face. "Ethan," she whispered, "I didn't put you anywhere. I just held up a mirror." That made something inside him snap, fear, pride, pressure, all knotting into something sharp. "You've been distracting," he said, words spilling faster now, harsher. "You're not trained in this world. You interpret things through your own personal scars, and maybe that's why you see danger everywhere. But that's not how decisions in my world are made." Her chest rose, fell, but she didn't step back. "You brought me here," she said quietly. "Not because you needed another analyst, but because you needed someone who wasn't afraid of you. Someone who could tell you what your team wouldn't." He swallowed hard, anger faltering for a moment, but pride held him upright. "And now," he said, "now, you're making my work impossible." Grace stood very still, hands resting on her bag, like she was steadying herself. "I thought," she said, her voice a whisper edged with trembling restraint, "that you wanted the truth, not comfort." He froze. The words cut straight through every layer he'd been trying to bury: fear, frustration, guilt, and they hurt because they were true. He should have stopped, should have apologized, should have breathed before speaking again. But the weight of the board, the whispers, the judgment, it all twisted inside him until the wrong words came out. "I think it's better," he said, "if we end this consulting thing, effective immediately." For a moment, just one, something fragile in her eyes cracked. Not anger, not shock, hurt. She bent slightly, gathering her notes and the pen she'd always brought from home instead of borrowing one from the office. Her movements were deliberate, steady, but her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm, too calm. "Your pen is safe now, Mr. Cole," she said softly. "It will only sign what they put in front of you." He felt the blow like a hand pressed hard against his chest. Grace. But she was already turning. She walked out of his office, without another word, without another glance, leaving behind a stillness so complete it made him feel suddenly, painfully alone. The door clicked shut. Ethan stood there, breath tight, the echo of her last sentence hanging heavy in the air. He had wanted control. He had wanted certainty. But all he felt now was the sharp, unmistakable sting of regret, and the empty space where she had stood felt larger than any office in the building. For weeks, Ethan moved like a man walking underwater, slow, heavy, aware of every sound and yet disconnected from all of them. After Grace left, the board meeting happened exactly as he expected. Clean, efficient, full of numbers and confidence. The senior living acquisition, once a sharp debate, was now a smooth runway. With his hesitation removed, everyone else pushed forward with a kind of celebratory certainty. No one questioned the decision now. No one mentioned the concerns Grace had raised. No one said her name. Ethan showed up, sat through the presentations, nodded when appropriate. He initialed paperwork, skimmed emails, approved budgets. All the motions of leadership, without any of the heart. He didn't argue again. Not because he agreed, but because he felt like he no longer had the right to. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a hollowness settled over him. At first, he tried to drown it in work, long nights, longer weekends, but the elegance of spreadsheets and projections no longer held any comfort. Numbers had become faces, and he couldn't unsee them. About a month after Grace walked out of his office, the first small news report surfaced. A local Denver outlet ran a 2-minute segment. Families of residents at a recently acquired senior facility complaining about reduced staff, fewer nurses on night shift, meals that were smaller. He watched the clip 3 times. A woman in her 60s, voice trembling with frustration, said her mother waited almost an hour for help after falling in her room. A volunteer whispered that supply closets were always short. A nurse said nothing on camera, but her eyes said everything. Colehart Capital's name was never mentioned, not directly. The acquisition had layers of subsidiaries to shield them from headlines. Still, Ethan recognized the facility name instantly from his paperwork. He muted the television and sat there, fingers pressed against his eyelids, feeling something heavy twist inside his chest. 2 days later, another report emerged. Then a third. Most were small, local voices. Nothing that would ever reach national outrage. Complaints from ordinary people without influence. The type of people whose voices Grace had always tried to interpret for him. One Thursday afternoon, as he left the office later than usual, he noticed a small protest gathered outside one of the firm's satellite buildings. 6 people, bundled against the cold, holding handmade signs. Protect our seniors. Cut bonuses, not care. Do better. Their presence was quiet. No chanting, just people standing, hoping someone inside the glass tower would see them. Ethan paused at the revolving door. He watched them for several seconds, unseen from the streetlight's shadow. Then he turned and walked the long way around to the garage, avoiding their eyes, avoiding the reflection of himself in the windows. He didn't sleep that night. 3 mornings later, he woke with an ache he couldn't name. Without overthinking it, he grabbed his keys and drove west out of Denver. He didn't call ahead, didn't check maps, didn't tell his assistant. He just drove. Nearly 50 miles later, he pulled into a quiet town he had never visited before. A place marked by faded storefronts, muted colors, and wide streets that seemed to hold more memory than life. He parked in front of a mostly empty strip plaza, a line of worn brick buildings, half the windows covered with brown paper. A large sign leaned crookedly on one corner, for lease price reduced. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. Old gum stains marked the walkways. A faded mural on the side wall showed a once thriving main street that no longer existed. Ethan stepped out of the car slowly, as if the air itself carried weight. That's when he saw him, an older man on a bench, wrapped in a flannel jacket, watching the traffic that barely passed. Ethan approached with a nod. "Morning," the old man glanced up. "You're not from around here." "No," Ethan admitted. "Just passing through." "Not much left to see," the man said dryly. Ethan hesitated, then glanced at the boarded space directly behind the bench. "What used to be there?" The man's face softened, nostalgic, a little sad. "Best hardware store in 3 counties," he said. "Family run. Folks trusted them. You could go in with nothing but a broken hinge and come out with advice, a tool, and a story." Ethan's throat tightened. "What happened to it?" The man shrugged. "Same thing that happened to half the town. Some redevelopment firm bought the strip. Promised big things. Raised the leases sky high. Folks held on as long as they could. But good people don't beat the math." "Did the redevelopment ever happen?" Ethan asked quietly. The old man barked a laugh. You're standin' in it. Empty buildings, half-finished permits, nothing but ghosts. A long silence stretched between them. The cold breeze carried the faint creak of a loose sign. A tumble of dry leaves rolled across the pavement. Ethan swallowed hard. Do you remember the family? The owners? Oh, sure, the man said. Good folks. Daughter moved away. Son got a job out east. Father had some health issues after losing the store. Broke him, if you ask me. The air left Ethan's lungs in a slow, painful exhale. He thanked the man, walked back to his car, and sat behind the wheel without turning the engine on. The plaza stared back at him, empty, cracked, abandoned, and familiar in a way he wished it wasn't. He thought of Grace's voice, the night she handed him the foreclosure notice. How quiet she'd been. How steady. How deeply tired. He closed his eyes. Somewhere between the spreadsheets and deals, between the ambition and applause, he had stopped wondering who lived behind the numbers he manipulated. Who bled quietly when he pressed approve. Now he knew. He knew too much. And he couldn't unknow it. He sat there for a long time, long after the sun dipped behind the foothills, alone in a parking lot shaped by decisions he'd made from a warm, distant office. When he finally turned the key in the ignition, his hands were trembling. Something had shifted inside him. Something irreversible. Something he didn't know how to face yet. And Grace was nowhere in his life anymore to help him understand what to do next. It was nearly closing time when Ethan pushed open the glass door of Timberline Steakhouse, the warm smell of roasted garlic and seared ribeye washing over him, like a memory he didn't know he'd been carrying. He hadn't been back since the night everything started. The night Grace had stunned him with a truth sharper than any market analysis. The night he'd seen himself through her eyes and hadn't liked the view. Tonight, she didn't even glance in his direction. She moved between tables with practiced calm, her hair pulled back, apron tied tight. Only the rigid set of her shoulders betrayed that she had seen him the moment he walked in. Ethan sat at an empty booth in her section, hands folded, eyes lowered. He didn't deserve her attention. He wasn't sure he deserved a conversation. Grace delivered a glass of water without a word. Grace, he tried. Your server will be with you shortly, she said in a tone so polite it felt colder than anger. He nodded. He didn't blame her. He waited. Through the rest of her shift, he stayed where he was silent, still, watching the quiet choreography of her work. Noticing the way she helped the younger waitress lift a heavy tray. The way she picked up silverware off the floor without anyone asking. The way exhaustion carved gentle shadows under her eyes. When her break finally came, she walked toward the back, toward the metal door that led to the dumpsters and the alley where restaurant truth-telling always seemed to happen. He followed at a respectful distance. The door clanged shut behind them. Cold night air wrapped around them both. The hum of industrial vents filled the silence. Grace crossed her arms. Say what you came to say. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Tired in a way that made something twist inside him. Ethan swallowed. I'm sorry. She blinked once, guarded. For which part? Good. She wasn't going to let him off easy. He didn't deserve easy. For all of it, he said. For doubting you. For firing you. For acting like you were some emotional liability. Instead of the only person telling me the truth. She looked away. You didn't just doubt me, Ethan. You used me as a shield. When the board turned on you, you needed somewhere to aim your fear. You chose the easiest target. He closed his eyes briefly. I know. And I hate that you're right. Her silence pressed him forward. I've been a coward, he said softly. For a long time. I told myself the world was too complicated for morality. That efficiency was the same as progress. That collateral damage was unavoidable. He dug a hand into his pocket. His fingers brushed the folded note he'd written earlier in his car, then decided against giving. Raw words were better tonight. I went to your hometown, he said. She stiffened. I saw the plaza, the empty storefronts, the cracks. The bench where a man told me about your parents' hardware store, like it was a piece of history the town still grieved. Grace's breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. I stood there, Ethan continued, in the middle of something my firm helped break, and I couldn't breathe. Couldn't pretend it was just business anymore. A long silence hung between them. The wind rustled a discarded receipt along the pavement. Grace finally spoke. "You think visiting a ghost town gives you redemption?" The words weren't cruel, just honest, clear as glass. "No," Ethan said. "Redemption's not mine to decide, but action is." "What action?" He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "I want to pull out of the senior living deal." She stared at him, stunned. "I want to expose the cuts, the liability manipulations, the back-office tactics," he continued. "All of it. Even if it costs me my title, my board seat, my reputation." Grace stepped back slightly, studying him, the man she once saw as untouchable, now standing in a cold alley behind her workplace, trembling under the weight of the truth he finally chose to face. "You'll be fighting your own company," she said quietly. "I know. They'll come after you. I know that too. And you're not exactly trained for this kind of fight." He gave a humorless smile. "That's why I came. Because you see the angles I don't. You see the people inside the numbers. And I can't navigate this without you." He looked down. "I understand if you won't help me. Truly." Another long silence. A car passed at the end of the alley, headlights sweeping briefly across the cracked asphalt, then disappearing into the night. Grace took in a slow breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, so steady it made him lift his head. "If we do this," she said, "we don't do it to make you feel better. We don't do it so you can sleep at night." Ethan nodded, hanging on every syllable. "We do it," she continued, "so people like my dad stop paying the price for decisions made in rooms they never see." Her words hit him harder than any boardroom accusation ever had. He nodded again slowly, solemnly. "Yes," he whispered, "that's exactly why." Grace studied him for a long moment, and for the first time in weeks, something in her expression softened. "Then we do it carefully," she said. "Quietly. Thoroughly. And we do it right." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Grace," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." She didn't smile. She didn't forgive. But she gave her word. And for the first time, they were no longer Billionaire and Waitress. They were partners standing at the edge of something dangerous, something necessary, something that might finally pull the truth into the light. Yet as they walked back toward the restaurant door, side by side, Ethan couldn't shake the tremor of fear in his chest. Not fear of losing his company, but fear that undoing the machine he'd built might require a cost he still hadn't faced. The evidence piled slowly at first. A memo here, a budget spreadsheet there. 3 emails forwarded from an anonymous account inside the partner company. Every piece had the same quiet, chilling theme. Cost savings justified at the expense of the people who needed care the most. Grace sat beside Ethan at his long dining table late into the night, her hair falling loose, a stack of documents in front of her. A mug of untouched tea cooling at her elbow. Ethan stood by the window, papers in hand, watching the city skyline flicker like a constellation he no longer recognized. "These projections," Grace said, tapping the page gently, "they don't even pretend to hide it. When they say manageable lawsuits, they mean predictable injury patterns. They've budgeted suffering." Ethan felt that line like a punch. He paced. "We can't leak this anonymously. Spun, discredited." "No," she agreed. "It has to be public, and it has to come from you." He stopped walking, turned toward her, the realization dawning with a heaviness that stole his breath. "You're saying I have to burn down my own house." Grace reached across the table and steadied one of the pages with her hand. "No, you're not burning it down, you're turning the lights on. If the foundation collapses, that's because it was already cracked." They looked at each other in the dim room, partners in something that neither of them had imagined months ago. The next morning, Ethan's attorney sat across from him in the office, leaning forward with both elbows on her knees. "You understand what you're proposing is career suicide?" she said plainly. "I'm aware. You could be removed as CEO. The board could file civil action for breach of fiduciary duty." He nodded. "You could lose everything you've built." Another nod. The attorney sighed, folding her hands. "Ethan, I've represented men who spent their entire lives avoiding responsibility. You stepping into it willingly is rare. But you need to understand the scale of what you're risking. He did understand. That was the point. They chose the annual shareholders meeting, the most public stage, the largest audience, the one place where burying the truth would require a shovel the size of the Rockies. Grace arrived early, dressed simply dark dress, hair pinned back, nothing to draw attention. She sat near the back, where spouses and administrative staff blended into comfortable anonymity. Only her eyes betrayed alertness, scanning the room as if expecting a storm. Ethan appeared moments later, stepping onto the stage in a tailored suit that suddenly felt heavier than armor. Cameras flashed. Board members nodded stiffly. A moderator welcomed everyone with the usual scripted enthusiasm. The agenda displayed on the enormous screen behind them: market outlook, projected Q4 growth, Crosspine senior living acquisition, leadership vision. When Ethan finally stepped to the podium, the room settled into a hush. He began the way everyone expected: numbers, trends, reassuring language that soothed investors like a warm bath. Then he paused. A long, uncomfortable pause. Grace straightened in her chair. "I'm deviating from the script," Ethan said. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Board members exchanged warning glances. The moderator stiffened. Ethan clicked a button on the remote. The screen behind him flashed, not the slide deck prepared by his team, but an internal memo stamped confidential. Projected savings through nutritional consolidation. Estimated 14% reduction. Murmurs started immediately. He clicked again. Another document appeared. Liability reserve increase. Anticipated injuries aligned with prior tier facilities cuts. Gasps now. Board members shifting in their seats. He clicked again. An email chain. Cold clinical language. Phrases highlighted in yellow. "We can push the limits." Most lawsuits settle quietly. Savings justify short-term PR risk. Ethan set the remote down. "This," he said, voice steady, "is the hidden side of the acquisition we've been preparing." Cameras clicked faster. Shareholders whispered urgently. The CFO looked pale. Ethan continued. "These documents show deliberate cost-cutting in areas that directly affect resident safety. They show awareness of foreseeable harm. They show a plan to normalize suffering because it saves money." He looked out over the room not as a CEO, but as a man stripped of excuses. "I have approved deals like this for years. Deals that looked clean on paper but left real people with real losses. I stood in a parking lot last week, cracked asphalt, empty storefronts where my firm made decisions that destroyed a family business. And I realized something simple. Profit built on this kind of damage isn't profit. It's debt. And eventually, someone has to pay." The hall was dead silent. Grace felt her heartbeat in her throat. "Therefore," Ethan said, voice firm now, "effective immediately, Cole Hart Capital will withdraw from the Crosspine acquisition." The room erupted. Shouts, gasps. A few claps from the back, hesitant but real. The board chairman shot to his feet, face red. "You don't have the authority." "I do," Ethan said calmly. "As long as I'm CEO, and if that changes today, then let it change. But before it does, there's more." He clicked again. A new slide appeared. Cole Hart Restitution Initiative. For families impacted by care reductions and redevelopment harm. Audible shock rolled through the room. "We will create a restitution fund," he announced, "to compensate families affected by cost-cutting in care facilities we've invested in. We will also establish a program to reinvest in small towns damaged by redevelopment projects we backed. Millions, possibly billions, gone from their projections. I know," Ethan said quietly, "that this will reduce our valuation, maybe significantly. And I also know that it's the right thing to do." Chaos broke out, some shareholders furious, others moved, some simply stunned. But in the back of the hall, Grace didn't move. She watched him stand alone on the stage, one man choosing conscience over comfort, truth over loyalty, humanity over profit. For the first time since she'd met him, she felt a tiny flicker of something unexpected. Pride. And maybe something more. But as the board members advanced toward the podium, faces tight with anger, She realized the moment wasn't over. The hardest part hadn't even started. It didn't take long. Within 3 weeks of the shareholders' meeting, the speech, the documents, the restitution announcement, Ethan Cole was called into a private session that lasted less than 40 minutes. When the door opened again, he no longer held the title of CEO. There was no drama, no outraged shouting, no slammed doors. Just a quiet signature on a separation agreement, and a dozen pairs of eyes watching him as though they'd never truly known him. Oddly, he felt lighter walking out than he had walking in. The press, however, did not go quietly. Headlines swung like pendulums. Billionaire maverick implodes his own deal. Cole resigns after shocking shareholder bombshell. Courage or folly? Analysts divided on Ethan Cole's move. Cable news debated him for an entire cycle. Some pundits said he'd lost his mind. Others said he'd found his soul. Ethan didn't watch any of it. Grace did. Not obsessively but carefully, watching how the narrative twisted, watching how the truth became something people tried to mold into their own story. And for the first time, when a reporter reached out and asked if she knew anything about the real-world impact of redevelopment and senior living cuts, she said yes. At first, she spoke without her last name, her voice steady but hidden. A few days later, she gave her full name, her own story, her parents' store, her father's decline, the loss that never made the news finally stepped into the light. Not to shame Ethan, not to punish him, but because the country needed to hear what the numbers did to families like hers. As her voice reached more ears, public pressure grew. Investigations opened into the Senior Living Partner Company. Attorneys general from 2 states demanded documents. Families who once filed quiet complaints suddenly had a spotlight. Ethan watched from the outside, no longer shielded by a corner office or a staff of analysts. He had become something unfamiliar to him, a private man with a very public conscience. And he wasn't done. One chilly March morning, he drove to a small office space on the east side of Denver. The building used to be a tutoring center. The paint was fresh, the floors refinished. The sign out front simply read, Harbor and Hearth Initiative. Inside, a dozen cardboard boxes lined the walls. Brochures sat half-designed on a table. A whiteboard displayed scribbled notes about community reinvestment, local lending circles, elder care staffing models, neighborhood revitalization. It was messy, small, beautiful in its own way. This time, it wasn't built on aggressive projections or efficiency models. This time, Ethan was building from scratch, using his own funds, his own mistakes, his own lessons. But he refused to do it alone. That afternoon, he met Grace in a park near her apartment. She arrived in jeans and a sweater, hair pulled into a loose bun, eyes wary but softer than they'd been weeks earlier. He handed her a folder. "What's this?" she asked. "A proposal," he said. "Something I want you to help me build." She opened it. Inside, mission statements, outlines, community business plans, elder care ethics guidelines she had once mentioned offhand during coffee breaks. At the back, a simple page. Co-founder, Grace Miller. She stared at it for several long seconds, then snapped the folder closed. "No," he blinked. I thought this was what you wanted." "It is," she said, stepping back a little. "But not like this." "What do you mean?" She took a breath. "Ethan, you don't need a mascot for your second act. You don't need a symbolic Waitress co-founder to show the world you've changed. That's not Grace, that's not what this is." "I know," she said gently, "but that doesn't stop people from seeing it that way. And besides," she hesitated, voice tight with something raw, "I'm not qualified. Not for this world." He stepped closer. "That world burned you, it didn't break you." Her eyes flickered. "I want you there," Ethan continued, voice low, earnest. "Not because of your story, not because of what happened to your father, but because you see what I can't. You notice the human cost in every corner. You ground the work in reality. You make the mission honest. And what if I mess up?" she whispered. "Then we fix it together." Silence settled between them, broken only by distant traffic and the rustle of early spring leaves. Grace looked away, blinking against the weight of possibility. The last time she believed in a system, it crushed her family. The last time she trusted a man in a suit, it took years to recover. Joining Ethan meant stepping back into the world she had sworn to keep at arm's length. He didn't rush her. He let the moment breathe. Finally, after what felt like a full season changing, Grace exhaled. "All right," she said softly. "I'll join." Relief washed over Ethan's face. "But," she added, holding up a finger, "there's one condition." "Anything," he said. "No investment that looks good on paper but feels wrong in a nursing home hallway." A slow smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Deal." And, she added, "no chasing growth for the sake of growth." "Deal." And nothing, absolutely nothing that hurts small towns trying to hold on. He placed a hand over his heart. "Deal. Deal. And deal." For the first time since the ruins of the boardroom battle, she smiled, really smiled, and something in him lifted. Not the thrill of winning, not the satisfaction of outsmarting anyone, but the quiet, humbling relief of beginning again, this time on ground that didn't tremble beneath his feet. They stood there for a moment, two people reshaped by loss, now bound by purpose rather than circumstance. But even as they walked toward the parking lot together, a shared future, taking shape step by cautious step. A reporter holding a notepad, and a story about to take a very different turn. The small hardware store sat at the edge of a modest Colorado town, its brick walls painted a warm shade of red that caught the last light of evening in a gentle glow. It wasn't grand, it wasn't flashy, it would never make the cover of a business magazine. But to the people who walked through its door, it felt like something sacred, a place pulled back from the edge of disappearance and turned into a light for the community. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign, Miller & Son Hardware, Community Workshop and Learning Center, in honor of George and Linda Miller. Grace had cried the day they mounted it. Not loud tears, just a quiet shimmer in the corners of her eyes as she ran her fingers across her parents' names, carved carefully into the grain. Now, a few years later, the store hummed with a life her parents would have recognized. Hammers echoed from the workshop in back. The scent of sawdust mingled with fresh coffee brewed in a small machine near the counter. Flyers for local fundraisers and small business fairs lined a corkboard by the door. Every Thursday night, the little place transformed into something even more special. A community classroom. They pushed aside displays of garden gloves and power drills to set up folding chairs. A projector screen dropped down from the ceiling, and Grace, who once thought she didn't belong anywhere near financial conversations, stood at the front, guiding neighbors through the maze of interest rates, leases, insurance clauses, and budgeting. But she taught it in a language everyone understood, plain English. Human words. Stories instead of formulas. This evening's class had drawn a mixed crowd. A group of retirees trying to make sense of rising costs, two young dads hoping to open a landscaping business, a single mom wanting to rebuild her credit, and a 19-year-old grocery cashier who sat in the front row, taking notes like her life depended on it. And, as always, near the back Ethan, jeans, boots, a flannel shirt, the least billionaire-looking billionaire anyone had ever seen. He didn't speak during the sessions. He didn't correct or add or weigh in. He simply listened, absorbing every word like a man, still making up for all the times he hadn't listened before. Grace stood at the front of the room, her hair pulled into a loose braid, her voice steady as she explained the fine print of adjustable rate leases. "Always read the part in the contract they expect you to skip," she told the class. "That's where the real story is." Ethan smiled. After the session, people lingered asking questions, sharing worries, hugging Grace like she'd just given them a tool to breathe easier. The 19-year-old cashier thanked her shyly and left with a stack of printed worksheets tucked under her arm. Once the crowd thinned, Grace began gathering chairs, humming softly to herself. Ethan helped, stacking the last row quietly, letting her lead the small end-of-night ritual she'd built. When they finished, the lights dimmed, leaving only the warm glow from the counter lamp. A young waitress from the diner down the street stopped by with a tray of styrofoam cups, Thursday night tradition. She was maybe 20. Hair pulled into a messy ponytail, apron streaked with flour. "Hey, Mr. Cole," she chirped, handing him a cup of coffee. "I caught the last 10 minutes. Could barely understand half of it, but it sounded important." Ethan chuckled. Grace makes it sound clearer than anyone else could. The waitress grinned, leaning against the counter. So tell me, if you had $1 million lying around, where would you put it? Ethan opened his mouth, but Grace, sorting papers behind him, heard the question and laughed. A real laugh. Soft, warm, easy, like a curtain lifting from an old window. Before he could answer, she stepped forward and said, "These days, he invests it in people who never get into the boardrooms, but still pay the price when things go wrong." The waitress blinked, surprised by the sincerity of the answer. Ethan added, quieter, "And in the waitress who finally taught him what money is for." Grace looked at him, then really looked, and for a brief moment, both of them stood suspended in the kind of silence that felt like a promise rather than a pause. The waitress smiled awkwardly, not entirely sure what she'd walked into, and slipped out with a wave. But the warmth she left behind stayed. Later, Ethan walked the last volunteer out the door while Grace turned off the workshop lights one by one. She stepped outside into the cool night air, locking the front entrance with a familiar twist of the key. The sidewalk outside the store glowed under a soft street lamp. Wind rustled gently through the leaves overhead. The town felt quiet, safe, alive. Ethan joined her, turning the small switch that powered off the neon open sign. Its blue light faded, reflecting against his face before dissolving into the dusk. They stood there for a long moment, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the storefront reborn from the ashes of all the pain that came before. Not a corporate tower, not a billion-dollar empire, just a place where broken histories had been mended, piece by piece, with gentleness and grit. Grace exhaled, a soft breath that bloomed into the cool night. "Funny," she murmured, "how everything started with a joke." Ethan nodded. "A bad one. The worst," she agreed. "But it led us here." She turned to him, her expression lit by the street lamp's glow steady, content. A little amazed. "It did," she said. "And here? Feels right." He didn't need to answer. The quiet between them did it for him. As they began walking toward their cars side by side, unhurried, the store's windows reflected their silhouettes against the dark. Two people who had been strangers, then adversaries, then a mirror to each other's failures and strengths. Now, partners, builders, healers of the very wounds that once defined them. And in the warm Colorado night, one truth settled gently into the space between them. The joke that had started everything had finally found its answer, not in profit, not in markets, but in people, and in the simple, steady work of making things right. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it. In a conversation we didn't plan, or in a truth we tried to avoid. Ethan and Grace came from different worlds, one built on numbers, the other shaped by the people those numbers forgot. And yet, somewhere between the weight of past mistakes and the courage to face them, they found something rare, a way forward. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to choose differently, to look beyond profit and see the human beings standing quietly in the margins, to admit we were wrong and still believe we can do better. And maybe the most comforting truth of all is this: you don't need $1 billion to make something right, just a willingness to listen, and a heart soft enough to change. When we finally allow ourselves to see each other not as roles or titles, but as people, that's when the real work of healing begins. Thank you for being here with us, for giving your time, your heart, and your quiet attention to a story that speaks to all of us in one way or another. If this journey moved you even just a little, please remember that every like, every share, and every subscribe helps us bring more stories into the world. Stories that soften us, remind us, and touch the soul. We're grateful you're part of this community. Until the next story, take good care of yourself and each other.